I drove yesterday past the White House. You can't really even see that the East Wing's been destroyed. I mean, it doesn't look that different, you know? And in fact, this is the secret. Hungary didn't look that different either when Orban was consolidating power. But if you can lock down power through legal and constitutional means, nobody has to notice, right? Until you try to get rid of the autocrat, and then you find that it's very hard.
ברוכים הבאים למרקרים, פודקאסט סוף השבוע של המרקרים. הזדמנות שלכם לקחת פסק זמן ממחזור החדשות היומיומי ולצלול איתנו לאירועים, לאנשים, ובעיקר לרעיונות מאחורי החדשות. כאן באולפן איתכם כבדי שבוע, גיא רולניק. שמענו בפתיח את פרופסור קים שפלי, משפטנית מאוניברסיטת פרינסטון בארצות הברית. חודש מרץ התחיל בתחושת הכרעה, אולי אפילו אופוריה, והנה אנחנו 5 שבועות לאחר מכן, בתחושת בלבול בעיקר. בתחילת המערכה מול איראן הוצגו לציבור הישראלי לכאורה יעדים ברורים, החלפת המשטר, עצירת תוכנית הגרעין, חיסול איום הטילים. האולפנים התמלאו בביטחון עצמי, הפרשנים דיברו על שינוי היסטורי, ורוב הציבור נסחף עם התחושה שאנחנו רגע לפני מהלך היסטורי מכריע. אבל ככל שהימים עברו, הפער בין ההבטחות למציאות רק הלך והתרחב, ובסוף הפסקת אש, לא ניצחון, לא שינוי אסטרטגי עמוק, אלא פסק זמן. והתחושה היא שמאחורי כל הרעש, אחרי 50, 60, 70 מיליארד שקלים, הרבה מהמציאות פשוט נשארה כמו שהיא. כמובן שלתוך הפער הזה נכנסת התעמולה, כי כשהמציאות מורכבת, מסרים פשוטים עובדים. האולפנים ממשיכים לשדר שליטה, הישג, כוח, עוד מסיבת עיתונאים בלי עיתונאים של נתניהו. אבל מיליוני ישראלים חברו כמובן משהו אחר לגמרי, שבועות של ריצה למקלטים, פחד מתמשך, ועכשיו גם מחלחלת ההבנה שהאיומים לא נעלמו, לכל היותר הם נדחו. אז איך מגשרים על הפער הזה, מה עושה השלטון? כמובן תודעת חירום, מלחמה מתמשכת, איום מתמיד, תחושת אין ברירה. כל אלה לא רק מצבים ביטחוניים, אלא מסגרת תודעתית. בתוך מסגרת כזו הדיון הציבורי מצטמצם, שאלות היסוד נדחקות הצידה, וגם היכולת להבחין בין הצלחה לכישלון הולכת ונשחקת. וכאן קורה לנו משהו עמוק יותר, אנחנו מתחילים לאבד את היכולת להתמצא במציאות, מה באמת השתנה, מה באמת הושג, מהו הנרטיב, מה המציאות. ככל שהרעש גדול, ככה יכולת להבין קטנה. בדיוק ברגע הזה בחרנו לשוחח השבוע, לא עם עוד מומחה לאיראן, לא עם עוד מומחה לטילים, גם לא לגרעין, אלא עם פרופסור קים ליין שפלי מפרינסטון בארצות הברית. היא מומחית למשפט חוקתי, והיא דווקא חוקרת בשנים האחרונות, לא את ארצות הברית, לארצות הברית היא הגיעה רק לאחרונה, אלא מדינות כמו הונגריה, שחוו קריסה בדמוקרטיה. קים נמצאת בוושינגטון, היא עומדת בחלון המלון שלה בבירה, וכמו שתשמעו, מספרת לנו שהכל לכאורה נראה רגיל, תיירים, פריחת הדובדבן, רחובות שקטים, קצת יותר משטרה מהרגיל, ואז היא מוסיפה משפט אחד שמסביר הכל. גם הונגריה לא נראתה כל כך שונה, כשאורבן הפך אותה בהדרגה לסוג של דיקטטורה. וזאת הנקודה שלה, וגם החיבור לפודקאסט שלנו. דיקטטורות מודרניות לא מגיעות עם טנקים, הן מגיעות עם חוקים, עם מינויים, עם שינויים קטנים, לגיטימיים לכאורה. אפשר, פרופסור שפלי תגיד לנו תכף, להשתלט על מדינה באמצעים משפטיים שאף אחד לא שם לב. עד שאנחנו מנסים להיפטר מהמנהיג, ואז מגלים שזה מאוד קשה. והיא לא מדברת רק על הונגריה, היא מדברת על התהליכים בארצות הברית וכמובן על ישראל. אז בפרק הזה כמעט ולא נתעסק באיראן בעצם. נדבר על מה שאנחנו אמורים לדבר אם אין לנו מלחמה, אם אנחנו לא רצים לממדים, אם אנחנו לא עוסקים בביטחון כל הזמן. נדבר על דמותה של החברה הישראלית, נדבר על הבחירות הקרובות, נדבר על הסיכונים שעומדים בפנינו, נדבר על מה האופוזיציה צריכה לעשות כאן, בהונגריה ובוושינגטון. ונרחיב את המבט ונשאל מה קורה לדמוקרטיות כשהן לא קורסות בבת אחת, אלא נשחקות לאט ומבפנים. אז הנה השיחה עם פרופסור קים ליין שפלי. Kim, let me start with Hungary. As we head into this Sunday's election, the first question is, how real is the possibility that Viktor Orban actually loses power?
This is such a good question. We're all looking forward to Sunday to see. Now, it turns out that, the challenger, Peter Magyar, is, depending on the poll, 10 to 20 points ahead of Orban. And this has been reliably in polls for months now. So it's not just one poll, not one blip. If this were a free and fair election, it would be an obvious answer. But this is not a free and fair election. And the election system has been systematically tilted in favor of Orban over the last 16 years that Orban's been in power. So the estimates are by people who really are expert at running these numbers that if Orban can hang on to 45% of the votes, he will be reelected, which is to say a majority election for Magyar will not guarantee he gets into the parliament. And the numbers also indicate that if Viktor Orban manages to get 50%, he might even be reelected with his magical 2/3 of the Hungarian parliament. The reason why 2/3 matters in Hungary is that if you have 2/3 of the seats, you can change the constitution and put yourself above the law. That's what Orban's had for the last 16 years. Now, I think it's unlikely, given these polls, that he can get 2/3. I don't think it's completely unlikely that he could actually come back with a simple majority. But here's the problem. I think actually the most likely outcome is that Peter Magyar actually wins a majority in parliament. It's almost impossible to imagine, given the election system, that Peter Magyar could get his 2/3. If Peter Magyar gets a simple majority, so much of the constitutional system in Hungary is locked down by laws that require a 2/3 vote to change, that Peter Magyar doesn't have much room for maneuver. And added to that is the fact that the Hungarian parliament last December changed the law on the presidency to make it virtually impossible for the parliament to impeach the president. The president gets to sign off on all laws that this parliament would pass, and the president is a holdover Fidesz appointment. So even if Magyar can pass a simple law, it will almost surely be vetoed by one of Orban's agents. So we have to look not only at the election itself, but what the possibility would be for Peter Magyar to govern if he wins this kind of bare majority.
So it sounds all pretty scary. Let me try to reiterate to what you said, that even if Magyar wins, there are a lot of scenarios that actually Orban administration is somehow entrenched.
Exactly. So let me just give you one example. Suppose that Peter Magyar does want to make future elections free and fair. Okay, one of the ways that Orban has tilted the playing field is by this American habit of gerrymandering. Okay, now Orban re-gerrymandered the country in 2014. I should say, just as I explain this, that when Hungarians go to vote, they actually get 2 votes. One is for the constituency that they live in, first past the post, like U.S. congressional elections. And the second is a vote for a political party. And there's sort of a complex mathematical formula that determines exactly how those seats are allocated. But there are 106 single-member districts. Okay, Orban redrew all those districts in 2013. And in 2014, with 45% of the vote, he won 91% of those districts. Okay, and he adjusts that system as he goes along, and he even adjusted it before the current election to take a couple of certain seats away from Peter Magyar and to put them in districts that he's more likely to win. Okay, so suppose Peter Magyar comes to power and decides, I need to make these elections free and fair. We're going to redraw the districts to be more competitive, more open. The law that defines the districts is a several hundred-page law in which every single border between the districts is written in by street name, by longitude, latitude, into the law, and the law can only be changed with a 2/3 vote of the parliament. So he can't change the election system. I mean, just under no scenario do we see that, unless he just decides this is an illegitimate system and we're just going to break the law.
Just to remind our audience who is the opponent, Peter Magyar, he's not really a liberal, nor he comes from the same party of Orban. And his politics are not that different from Orban in many ways.
Exactly. So Peter Magyar sort of came of age within Orban's party. He's had a career inside Fidesz, Orban's party, first as a member of what's called the Perm Rep of Hungary to the EU. Every member state of the European Union participates in the work of the Council of Ministers. That Council of Ministers is run, the state memberships are run by these things called permanent representations, which are like fancy embassies in Brussels. And Peter Magyar worked there for several years. Then he was brought back to Hungary. He's been involved in, shall we say, the corrupt network of Orban's companies. And so, his own hands are, I don't know, detail anything horrible, but he certainly has benefited from the Orban system. He broke out of the Orban system in February 2 years ago. And what brought him out of the woodwork, so to speak, was the fact that his ex-wife had been probably falsely accused of engineering. She did engineer a pardon for a guy who had been head of a kind of an orphanage, a state school, where some of the faculty had engaged in sexually abusing the kids. And the head of the school had covered it all up. They were all criminally convicted. His ex-wife, who was justice minister at the time, recommended the pardon. The president pardoned that person. And in the outcry that resulted, Orban fired them both. So Peter Magyar comes out of the woodwork, after this very contested, messy divorce with his wife, the ex. And his opening comment was, how dare Orban hide behind women's skirts? And then he's off to the races, right? And then he starts to give interviews. He starts to actually make public secret recordings he made of his wife when she was still justice minister, detailing Orban's corruption. It was obviously a kind of spectacular break, one of the first really visible breaks with Orban's system. And he immediately gets a following of people who are upset about the corruption and also upset about the pedophilia, and the understanding that Orban's people are probably not behind it, and not participating in it, but condoning it, and because all these guys are their friends. So it's a bit like, the Epstein scandal in the U.S.,
Only way to get attention with people today.
Exactly.
Is you have pedophiles involved. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So there's a bunch of scandals in Hungary that really seem familiar from U.S. politics. Okay. So Peter Magyar then comes out as kind of this savior. In fact, some of his supporters in the early days used to actually use quasi-religious language because he would wear these incredibly, shall we say, tight clothes. And he was, in tight-fitting pants, tight-fitting shirts. His nickname at the beginning was Slim Fit Jesus, as the savior who comes out of the Orban circles. And he's very charismatic. And he plays to the camera. He's been quite disciplined about an opposition message, focused on Orban's corruption and the cronyism and the way in which the Orban circle has enriched itself at the expense of the average Hungarian. He focused on the fact that the healthcare system was falling apart, which it was. He would go into hospitals with cameras and show just how bad it was, and so on. So he showed he was playing into this narrative, which is true, by the way. Orban has made Hungary either the poorest or tied for poorest country in the EU. Didn't start there when Orban took office. There's been massive inflation. There's been, sort of massive disruptions to the economy. Most Hungarians feel like their lives have gotten worse and the public services have become unusable. And in the meantime, Orban's family are building palaces. Magyar exposed the fact that on the territory neighboring Orban's father's palace, there was a little herd of zebras that had been brought into Hungary. And so then all of a sudden there are all these zebra memes, like Orban riding a zebra and all this stuff. So he's played this campaign really cleverly and then decided to run for the European Parliament out of nowhere. He started like a sort of party. When I say sort of party, the party is really a party of one, and who knows who all the other people are that form the rank and file of this party. He's the only one who ever speaks for the party, but they won a substantial victory in the European elections. And then he was emboldened to run for prime minister, as the head of this TISA party. So, he's come out of Orban's orbit. He knows exactly where the bodies are buried. He knows exactly how that this corruption scandal is real, and he knows the details, and periodically leaks them out. That said, politically, he is an Orban mini-me. In fact, the reason why Orban's found it so hard to fight against him is that Peter Magyar is like Orban 20 years ago. If you knew Orban 20 years ago, Orban was charismatic. Orban was incredibly good looking, right? He was very good at the camera, very good at discipline. He was promising to get rid of the corruption of the prior regime. In fact, Peter Magyar is almost exactly echoing the themes from Orban's first campaign in 2010. And so I think Orban's found it really hard to fight him because I think Orban looks at Peter Magyar and he sees himself in the mirror from 20 years ago. And it's really eerie how similar the two are.
But it sounds also as if, if Magyar actually wins, that at some point we'll find ourselves with a new autocrat, younger and maybe more effective, maybe less corrupt at first, but not very different.
Well, this is the big worry, right? I mean, we don't know much about Magyar's deep commitments to democratic government. He has not had a chance to show that. He's been in the Orban orbit for 20 years. Okay, and so he has had no other political life except within Fidesz, and he did not object at the time to the consolidation of power by Fidesz. He benefited from it. So one of the things, at least I'm worried about, and I know some members of the political opposition in Hungary are worried about, is that he will step into this machine that's been created by Orban, replace a few people, and then just keep the machine going, right? In fact, there's a slogan among some people who are on the actual left in Hungary, which Peter Magyar is not. Then they say, first we get rid of Orban, then we may have to get rid of Peter Magyar, right? So we just don't know exactly what he's going to do with this system that he inherits. He doesn't have much room for maneuver. And he could just step into Orban's shoes and keep driving this corrupt machine.
Okay. So given the potentially grim outlook for these elections one way or another, let's move to the U.S. And Israel. You know what? Let's start with Israel. When you look at the past 15 years, and you've been studying Hungary for many years, when you look at the past 15 years in Hungary, and the way that Orban consolidated power and then basically destroyed all the democratic institution in a way that even now, if he loses the election, there is a big worry that the system will be entrenched. What do you think are the major lessons for a country like Israel at this point? That Netanyahu has been, dismantling the institutions in the last 3 years. It's not 15 years, but, he's been in power for many, many years. What do you think are the lessons for Israel?
Yeah, so what Israel and Hungary share is a very simple political system. Unicameral parliament, parliamentary system, a president that doesn't have much power, and the only check on the fusion of executive and legislative power that you get in the parliamentary system is a powerful judiciary. So when Netanyahu started going after the judiciary and also after the independent legal advice in the ministries, those were the only two checks, and it's very dangerous because once those checks are gone, then autocrats can govern without limit. Now Israel has something that Hungary never had. And to my mind, this was always the thing that kept Israel a democracy, despite the evident weakness of the structural protections in the institutions. And when I teach comparative government, I always say, what has kept Israeli democracy alive is unstable coalition governments, okay? Which means, lots of little parties, a lot of the coalitions are always fragile. If they can make it all the way through a term, it's rather exceptional. The coalitions are hampered by the fact that they have to juggle so many different things. That's been Israel's really major protection, actually, even more than the institutions. And so when you get a coalition like the current one, where each of the parties in power, essentially, the things that they want to do would have been considered illegal except for the fact that they now all protect each other. And it's a kind of rogues alliance in which they're all completely reliant on each other. And therefore, it's very hard to make that coalition fall or to pick off individual members or, it's just the most stable coalition I think that Israel's had in decades, right? And so that's actually the big danger, is that you get a coalition that can't be broken, and that then attacks the institutions. So that's the worry. It's a slightly different picture because in Hungary, the state of the coalition government is less crucial than the institutions. But that strikes me as being Israel's big problem now.
How important in Hungary, let's go back for a second, Hungary, before we draw a comparison to Israel, how important was the consolidation of influence over the news media in Hungary for the entrenchment of Orban?
Yeah, so the news media matter a lot, and they may matter in some ways more in Hungary than they may matter in Israel. And that's because there are very few Hungarians, I mean, it's like less than 20%, who actually can carry on a conversation in a foreign language. So Hungary's a little isolated linguistic bubble. And therefore, when Orban took over the television first, and then took over the radio stations, and then dominated the main, media, print media, and then kept bouncing different online websites offline. If you speak another language, Orban never shut down the internet. You could read English, you could read German, you could read whatever, but that's a very small part of the Hungarian population. So as a result, as Orban's oligarchs bought up the Hungarian media, and that's how they took control. They didn't shut them down by force. They didn't imprison journalists. They just, by regulation, weakened the financial position of the media. And then as they all teetered, the oligarchs swoop in and buy the media at bargain basement prices. And Orban can really control what Hungarians see and read and think because of the Hungarian language bubble that he controls. And so that's really crucial. And, media are always important to democracy. The less vibrant and pluralistic media, the worse off democracy is. But it's especially catastrophic where you've got a tiny language and somebody who's got really tight control over almost everything that appears in that language.
What was the role of social media in the democratic discourse or the information ecology in Hungary?
Yeah, so social media have been really crucial, actually, and particularly Facebook. I mean, every country has its favorite social media platform, and in Hungary, it's Facebook. Orban, of course, infiltrated the Facebook networks. It was, you could constantly get Orban propaganda. That said, Hungary is a small country in this regard, like Israel, where people know each other. So if you know who you're following, and you're 2 steps away from somebody who has very good information on a personal basis, you can figure out who to follow, and that was really, I think, very crucial in maintaining the democratic opposition. So yeah, so I think that mattered. Now, I think the other thing, though, is that, and especially for this election, we're seeing something really interesting happening with social media. So Viktor Orban, in the last European election, his party, Fidesz, was the leading advertiser on social media in the election campaigns for the European election in other member states. So Orban was buying German media, to advertise for the AfD. He was buying French media to advertise for Marine Le Pen's party. And across Europe, he was advertising using Fidesz money, which is probably Hungarian state money, using this to bank or sort of give free advertising to that party. After the European elections were over, Orban was able to cobble together, out of all those people elected on all those parties he supported, the 3rd largest party in the European Parliament. And a lot of that was the social media that Orban targeted outside the country. Okay, so as a result of that, the EU saw that. EU doesn't like Orban much, as you can imagine, because he keeps trying to sabotage whatever they're doing. They passed a regulation that prohibits political advertising on social media. And that just went into effect last year. Orban suddenly lost one of the major mechanisms he had for influence, not only abroad, but also in his own country. So he immediately turns around and he creates what he calls the digital fight circles. He's trying to get his supporters to get online and just spam everybody else with all their pro-Orban media, which would then not be political advertising. right? And so the problem is a lot of his supporters are kind of people from the countryside who are not very adept at social media. Like it was all outgoing, not so much incoming. So that hasn't worked very well. So in the last month, what's happened in the Hungarian election is that Orban has welcomed into Hungary a little team of Russian disinformation specialists who came in with Orban's blessing. They had to come into Hungary because they needed somebody to translate all their Russian bots into Hungarian. And suddenly you see all this kind of, it looks like, I mean, if you're used to how Russian bots operate, now that you see that on social media in Hungary. But, there was this great investigative journalist who discovered it. It came out that this was happening. Orban didn't disown it. And now everybody knows to look for Russian bots, right? One of the reasons why Orban is just flummoxed and can't seem to get his footing in this election is that his tried and true strategies for mobilizing his public have been, shall we say, disabled with clever EU regulation, clumsy Russian interference, and the fact that his population, his voters are digitally illiterate. Not all of them, but many. Anyway, these far-right parties always get their strongest support from the least educated population. So, he hasn't been able to get these digital fight circles.
And then again, we talk about entrenchment, even if Peter Madior wins, the media is still owned by cronies of Orban.
That's right.
And the question is,
right.
Will he be able to bring them to heel, or are they going to still sabotage everything that he's trying to do?
Yeah, so the opposition's been also now very clever about media. So they own no TV channels. They can't get any broadcast frequencies. They started a YouTube channel. It's called Partisan. Everybody goes there for their news if they want some contrary viewpoints, from the government's party line. And that's been very effective. When all the opposition radio stations were taken off the air, they created a streaming service. When the newspapers started being shut down, a lot of the journalists, because as Hungary now is becoming a bigger and bigger international story because it's interfering with the EU, it's collaborating with Russia, Trump loves them, it's becoming a bigger international story. So a lot of the best multilingual Hungarian journalists are now the journalists for the Financial Times and Reuters. And, so they've gone to work for the international press and then have a good social media presence outside the country through those international media. So they've found ways to survive. And there still are a couple of online websites that have not been shut down yet. So, if you want in Hungary to get the news in Hungarian, you can.
At the end of the day, Hungary is a tiny country, even smaller than Israel. And yet the VP, Trump's VP, finds the time in the middle of the war, in the middle of everything, what's happening in the U.S., to travel this week to Budapest and to basically participate in a rally for the re-election of Orban. Why is it that Trump, MAGA, and the populists outside Hungary, even in the biggest and the most powerful country in the world, still thinks that it's worthwhile and it's important for them to try to help Orban?
So first of all, J.D. Vance's visit followed a visit by Marco Rubio after the Munich Security Conference. So this is the two people who are, American analysts say next in line to succeed Trump as head of the MAGA movement. Both of them show up, in the months running up to the election. Now, Hungarians being Hungarians, okay, got to tell you a little story. So Hungarians' favorite children's book is Winnie the Pooh. It was translated into Hungarian really quickly by one of Hungary's best poets. So the way that it appeared in Hungary is not exactly a direct translation. And the most favorite character and the main character in the Hungarian version is the character known in English as Eeyore, the donkey, right, who's perpetually depressed. Okay, the reason for saying that is a little Hungarian culture, but also what Hungarians were saying when J.D. Vance showed up yesterday was, and Trump himself didn't come, right? Which is a very Eeyore-like comment. Like, okay, he sends his vice president, but everyone's saying, and why didn't Trump come? And so it kind of backfired, right? It's all through the Hungarian, kind of at least opposition media today that if Trump were really serious about this, he would have come himself. Like Eeyore sees the
When he's in the
downside of
middle of
everything.
threatening civilization annihilation in Iran, he would go to Budapest. Yeah.
So I don't think it made much of a difference. But here's why it matters to Trump. Okay, so having the resources of a state and having a state in the EU is a tremendous resource for the far-right movement in Europe, because Orban can commandeer state resources of a sort that none of those other parties control, because he provides a safe home. Orban has invested 1% of GDP in this incredible kind of transnational training ground. The mothership is called the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, but in English they have this think tank called the Danube Institute. A lot of Trump's people have passed through the Danube Institute getting trained on how to set up a dictatorship. And so there's a very close tie between this Danube Institute and Trump's, supporters, or Trump's inner circle, really. So if you know the Trump blueprint under which he's governing is this thing called Project 2025. Project 2025 was written by a coalition of American conservative groups, but Orban's people were at the table. The Danube Institute was one of the partners drafting Project 2025. And a lot of the ideas, I've lived through the collapse of democracy in Hungary. Now I'm living through the attacks on democracy in the U.S. Many of the actual concrete things being done in the U.S. mirror exactly what Orban did in Hungary. So this is a connection that's very tight. It's not just admiring from afar. It's not just birds of a feather. It's not just, and I think it's not so much ideological agreement. Neither Orban nor Trump are ideologists. They say whatever they need to say to kind of attract a crowd, but they're transactionalists and they're corrupt. And the main reason for both of them governing is how to get public money into private pockets. Okay. And in that, they have a strong alliance, and Orban's been tutoring the Trump people in how to do that.
So let's move to the U.S. This interview is being held when you are now in Washington.
Yeah.
Okay. So how often do you go to D.C.?
Not very often. In fact, I just got here yesterday. And, Washington looks like Washington, except there's a bunch of still National Guard people milling around not knowing what to do. There's way more police everywhere. It sort of looks a bit like they're expecting a riot at any moment. But apart from that, they're tourists. We just got through the cherry blossoms. I drove, in my taxi yesterday past the White House. You can't really even see that the East Wing's been destroyed. I mean, it doesn't look that different, And in fact, this is the secret. Hungary didn't look that different either when Orban was consolidating power. The whole point of these new dictatorships is to do it in a way that cements power through law rather than brute force, although we're having a fair amount of brute force in the U.S. now, too, which is interesting. That's a real deviation from the Orban script. But if you can lock down power through legal and constitutional means, nobody has to notice, right? Until you try to get rid of the autocrat, and then you find that it's very hard.
Okay, so let's look at the last 14 months of the second Trump administration, the second tenure of Trump. Some people argue that actually Trump was able to achieve in terms of eroding the democratic institution in the U.S. in 14 months, something that is not very distant from what Netanyahu was able to do in 3 years, and for Orban it took more than a decade. So when you compare the three, who is the most effective one?
Well, people say it took Orban a decade. It didn't. It took him 3 years. After 3 years, he controlled virtually everything. And he hasn't given it up since, okay? In that sense, Orban's the most effective because he did it, very quickly. He did it unawares. It was a new model, so people didn't rise up and stop. And so I think that's by far the most effective. Netanyahu got immense pushback from the street. Those, before October 7th, those Saturday night demonstrations, there were 42 Saturday nights or something like that. It just the massive numbers of people who came to the streets and the diversity of that group, right? I mean, I don't know every Israeli, but I certainly know all the Israeli law professors. You had people out there demonstrating who don't agree on anything else, okay? But they could see the threat to the judiciary was absolutely crucial. And it was that public pushback. It was the calling out of that stuff. It was the vibrancy of civil society that really made a huge difference in Israel. It slowed Netanyahu down. In the end, the only law he passed was the one that, the reasonableness law. If that had gone through and if the court had upheld it, it would have been the least harmful of all the things he was planning. So it did, I think, slow him down a bit, which is, a good sign for Israeli democracy. Now, Trump is also getting pushback from American society, from state governors. We have a much more complex political system, which helps us in this regard. The problem Americans have is that Americans, to our eternal good luck, have not lived under a dictatorship within the living memory of any, American who's never lived anywhere else. Israelis have the memory of the Holocaust and of what brought that about and of the collapse of German democracy that made that possible, right? And Hungarians still remember the dictatorship, at least the older Hungarians remember the dictatorship under communism. That means that you get an early warning system. People understand how fragile democratic government is, and they will go to the streets quicker than people who just take democracy for granted. I still have colleagues who still think the Supreme Court in the United States is doing law as opposed to being a packed court, They don't see it. They just look for every ray of hope that the court is independent. Look, tariffs, look, birthright citizenship. And, I have to tell them, packed courts don't rule in favor of the government every single time. They have to preserve the illusion that they're still an independent court. They just will never rule against the executive when it comes to the consolidation of executive power. So, I'm constantly talking to my colleagues about what does it feel like to live under a dictatorship and why it's not what you think, All my colleagues who have had international experience saw what was happening right away. My American colleagues are still a bit in a cloud, they don't see it. So, American civil society has been slow to react. And fortunately, I hate to say this, but the thing that may save the U.S. from Trump in the end is the fact that he went off the Orban script, off the Netanyahu script, by just changing the laws to consolidate power. And Trump brought tanks to the streets, right? He called out the National Guard. ICE has been kidnapping neighbors these masked guys show up in unmarked cars and your neighbors disappear all over the country. That performative cruelty, right? That visible sign of brute force is the thing that's mobilized Americans.
People don't like that. People can see it, people can understand it, unlike changing the laws.
Exactly. And so because Trump was too impatient, he didn't wait until Project 2025 had consolidated his power. He had to see, these ICE squads go out with their own cameras to record videos for Trump. You see Trump blowing up boats in the Caribbean and then, displaying the snuff films on the White House or Defense Department websites. He's getting these videos of bombings in Iran. He wants to see the violence. And because he wants to see the violence, other people see the violence too. That's the thing that's mobilized Americans, but they don't understand that the autocratic capture is happening in a different place. And so Trump's need to see violence, I think, has mobilized Americans against him in a way that the pure legal autocratic capture has not.
You mentioned the Roberts Court, the Supreme Court. And when I look at the Roberts Court for more than 20 years now, it was always a court that was very much a pro-business court, pro-big business court.
Yeah.
And when we look at now, we haven't talked about, when we talked about Orban and Netanyahu and Trump, we haven't talked yet about the role of big business in this democratic backsliding. In the U.S., we see that the tech oligarchs that have pretended to be liberals for decades have come out of the closet in the last 2 years and basically said, no, actually, we are not really big on democracy, and they sided and aligned themselves with Trump. When you look at the U.S. and Hungary, and you look at the history of democratic backsliding, what is the role of big business and how does it manifest itself in the recent tide of, autocratic leaders?
Yeah, so the track record of business has never been good, right? I mean, you'll probably know the history of big business in Nazi Germany, right? They go along to get along. There may be a few corporate leaders who stand up, but business people are ultimately interested in being on the good side of a government that could regulate them. And they are particularly interested in being on the good side of a government that is willing to be bought, by the money and influence that big business has. We do have a few companies in the U.S. that are standing up to Trump. Business in Hungary pretty much caved in. In Israel, what was interesting watching their demonstrations was the threat of the tech sector in Israel to leave, which I think was really interesting and unusual. And so, but business in general doesn't mind oligarchs. I mean, it doesn't mind autocrats. I mean, if one person stays in power for 20 years, it just makes it easier on them. They don't have to keep making new friends, so to speak. So business is not always a fan of democracy. And, I think what we're seeing is in the U.S., I guess what's the most shocking part is the lack of leadership coming from anywhere. It's not coming from business. It's not coming from the law schools. It's not coming from university presidents, except my own at Princeton, I might add. He's been great, but he's one of a handful. You see all the people and the Democratic Party. I mean, where is it? What does it stand for? Is there any leadership? You see masses of people willing to put their lives on the lines to defend their neighbors and willing to turn up, in order to push back against Trump at these massive rallies. 8 million people at the last one, which for the U.S. is a big turnout. And no leadership, okay? That's really shocking. Let me just say one other thing about business. One of the things about business in a transnational economy is that business is mobile. If the U.S. becomes a hostile territory, they just move their headquarters somewhere else. If people are rich enough and these oligarchs, I mean, the amazing expansion of the gap between rich and poor.
Between the 0.1% and the rest of the people.
Yeah, between the 0.1% and the rest. The 0.1% have multiple passports, have their assets stashed in lots of different places around the world. If one country crashes, they can move on. So their fates are no longer tied to national governments. And the national governments know that, and they compete for keeping these businesses by giving businesses what they want. So that's the world in which we live, and we can't expect business to be the brave ones here.
So you talked about the lack of leadership in the U.S. Trump, before he came back to power, MAGA, they had Project 2025. Do the Democrats have Project 2028? Where they say if we get back to power, we need to unwind all the systems put in place by Trump, and we need to think about politics in a different way, given what we have learned in the U.S. and around the world in the last 10 years. We need to do politics in a different way. Is there such leadership within the Democratic Party that thinks about those things?
Yeah, so there's definitely, we're calling it Project 2029 because the president wouldn't take office till the January after the election. Yes, there's a Project 2029. That's the good news. The bad news is that there's at least 12 of them. There are all these different groups, some sort of former high-level Democratic leaders, some civil servants who are out of work, some are academics and consultants. I mean, the Democratic Party cannot unify under a single banner. Heritage, when it did Project 2025, unified all the conservative groups under one banner. We got tons of activity going on. I mean, the number of Project 2029s going on, I've lost count. Okay, but if there's an election, which one of those? And wouldn't it have been better if they talked to each other? And gotten on the same page the way that the Republicans did.
And when you look at those plans that they have, do you think, and you say there are multiple, do you think that they are serious, thoughtful thinking about how we do politics in a different way to make sure we don't end up again? Like we take measures that we haven't taken in the past, century or more, because we know that today, the speed in which people can consolidate power is unprecedented because of technology, because of social media, because of a lot of things, because of globalization. Do you see thoughtful plans that you say, okay, if we do that, we will distance ourselves again from a situation, from the precipice?
I do, but the question is how much support they have, right? So there's kind of an AOC Bernie Sanders Mamdani group, which is the most thinking of the most radical changes. There's the old sort of Clintonite faction of what we really need to do is restore normal. That was the kind of Biden approach between the two. Trump officials, there are people who worked inside specific government agencies, like state or justice or, going back to USAID, people who used to work in those agencies who are developing elaborate plans for reconstructing particular agencies. And there are people who come out with a legislative plan. Okay, now here's the problem. I mean, again, Americans don't know how this works in other countries. When I say the Supreme Court is packed, I don't say that lightly. This is a Supreme Court that it has been since Reagan. I mean, this is not just the 3 Trump appointees, right? Going back to Reagan, there was always a plan, being worried that the Republicans would not be able to maintain majorities in Congress, to put all power in the hands of a president, to rely on the Electoral College, which is a kind of counter-majoritarian institution, to put presidents into office, and to rig the voting rules to ensure that that happened, okay? This is a court that has not, every time a voting rights measure, for example, comes up before the court, this court going back to the 1970s, but certainly since Reagan and later, if you look at which, Republican, Democrat, who's favoring the rules, the Supreme Court has voted Republican, regardless of the content of the voting rights measure, okay? What we've steadily seen also since Reagan are the appointment of people who believe in what gets called in the U.S. the unitary executive theory. It's called a theory. It's now about to be a conspiracy. It's now actually happening, where the vast sprawling thing we think of as the U.S. government, is constituted by cabinet departments, U.S. agencies. I mean, just as far as the eye can see. The argument is that that whole apparatus comes under the control of the president alone and has to report directly up to him. And so what that means, Congress has set up many of those agencies to be buffered from political pressure. I mean, the most important is the Federal Reserve. That one seems to be a little bit immune in the Supreme Court's thinking. But, agencies where by law they have to be balanced between Democrats and Republicans in their governing boards, or where the terms of office of the occupants of these offices do not coincide with presidential terms, just to get a little distance between the agency buffering the expertise in the agency from political influence. The Supreme Court has told us there are a series of what we call shadow docket decisions. These are decisions that go up to the court, not on the merits of the case, so no oral arguments, no briefing. They go up on the question of what's the status quo while we're waiting for the case to be decided. And when a court determines the answer to that question, the court decides who's most likely to win. We're going to tilt the status quo in favor of who we think is going to win. So that tilts the court's hand. Okay, the court has said in the last year, the president can dissolve administrative agencies set up by Congress without seeking Congress's permission. The president can fire people that Congress has insisted be politically buffered from political firings. The court has said the civil service law may be unconstitutional because the president needs to be able to hire and fire everybody in the executive branch. They've said the president doesn't need to spend the money allocated by Congress because he has the independent authority to decide how to spend the money. And on and on. All of that is dictatorship consolidation.
And of course, the court 2024 ruling, Trump versus U.S. The court said that the president is immune from
the president is
criminality as long as it's in office.
Right. Now, actually, here's my darker way to even read that case, which is pretty dark, right? You can just say he's immune from anything he does in his official capacity. Another way to interpret what the court just said is that Congress may not regulate the president's conduct with criminal statutes. And now the court is saying, and Congress may not regulate how the president runs the government, either in what the agencies are, how they're constituted, who fills them, what money they spend. Congress has been written out of the Constitution in the last year by decisions of this court. That's why I say it's a captured court. This is really dark.
Given that this is the Supreme Court, what should the 2029 plan of Democrats should be? How do you deal with that?
So I think we need really creative thinking. Okay, so right now my favorite, there's a lot of options floating around. Let me just give you one example of how creative you can get, right? The Constitution says there shall be one Supreme Court. Okay, we have one Supreme Court. The Constitution also says that court hears the following kinds of cases as a matter of original jurisdiction, which means the cases on those topics go first to that court. Okay, so suppose Congress passes a law saying we have one Supreme Court. It hears only those cases where the Constitution says it has original jurisdiction. Because that Article 3 of the Constitution also goes on to say, and such other courts as Congress shall create. So it gives permission for Congress to create, let's call it a general appeals court that handles everything else the Supreme Court does except original jurisdiction. It's got an appeal up and maybe the same, discretionary docket. You can even reproduce the Supreme Court at a level below the Supreme Court. So we still have one Supreme Court. Doesn't interfere with the original jurisdiction. It is a Congress. Congress sets up this court. And all the cases that would normally go to the Supreme Court now go to this brand new court. Let's try that.
Given the huge role today that big tech plays in shaping public discourse, and they are the most, powerful political actors today, Meta and Google and, of course, Elon and the rest of the people in Silicon Valley. Do you think legal scholars like you and people who are interested in preserving liberal democracy in the U.S. should also start thinking about the questions of who owns the media in the U.S. and who owns big tech? I'll give you an example. So in 2013, when Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post, all the left-leaning journalists in DC, where you are today, were so happy. He's our savior, and he's going, and journalism is lost its business model, but now we have the benevolent tech mogul Jeff Bezos. And then in the last 2 years, we saw that actually Jeff Bezos see the Washington Post as merely a tool to make sure that the government doesn't take antitrust action against Amazon. And the question is, what can, under existing law, or maybe we should change the law, how can the U.S. democracy protect himself from people like Bezos and Musk and Zuckerberg basically taking over traditional news media and the digital news media?
Well, we're starting to see, and actually Hungary gives us a good example of how you do this, which is essentially the journalists formed cooperatives and, massively reduced their costs by just going online, took advantage of being able to be incorporated outside the country. And so they did a lot to buffer themselves by not relying on oligarchs and so on. It means that, you need to donate money to this. They set themselves up as foundations, hoping to attract charitable donations without attracting control from the donors, right? In European countries, public media is supposed to perform that function. Of course, once an autocrat captures the government, they capture the public media. That's the weakness, as we now see, of that system. In Poland, Hungary, even the BBC is teetering on the brink of a kind of political criticism. So I think the way forward is going to have to be through something like private foundations. And, that may require changing some laws. For example, donations to public foundations for the media are tax deductible. Or, trying to figure out how to free media both of potential government control and of oligarchic control. This is tough. Like, where does money come from, right? And so, what I've been telling people in the U.S., also in Hungary, and people say, like, what can I do? Like, I'm just one person. I say, you subscribe to all the media that are still producing serious news. We've seen a movement of a lot of journalists in the U.S. towards Substack, where they kind of control their own appeal to the world. Now, Substack's got a little bit of its own problems too, but, finding public platforms to do this stuff. So it may be that we're seeing is the transformation of journalism into something that is a much more foundation-based public service entity, and that may be the only way to protect it. Totally different model. That said, the advent of the new media makes at least the mechanics of running the media cheap. You don't have to own a printing press. You don't have to buy paper. Right? You don't even need an airwave, which puts you like a broadcast frequency, which puts you under government control.
No, that's true. But the other thing is, and you mentioned it is happening in Hungary, is that once you are in the digital world, you are your distribution and your reach is based on algorithm. And Russia and China and autocrats know how to manipulate those algorithms because they have the power and the money. And when you have people like Elon Musk controlling the X, and tomorrow you have Mark Zuckerberg aligning with Trump, you're not going to, as a liberal voice, you're not going to get a lot of traction with the algorithms once you are only digital.
Right. Well, this is why in the U.S., I think, we've seen a tremendous growth of a platform called Blue Sky, which has open algorithms. You can choose your algorithms. It seems to be owned and managed by people who are committed to not turning the platform into a cesspool. But pardon my saying so, but Twitter is just so full of unbelievable crap. So we need new platforms too. I think what we're seeing is that we took too many things for granted about how democracy works. And you need support for civil society. You need support for the media. You need support for complexity in government. I know that sounds really weird, but you get a government like Israel's or Hungary's unicameral parliamentary systems with only the court as a check. Those are incredibly vulnerable systems.
Yeah. Let's end with Israel. What is your advice for the opposition in Israel if it takes power in the coming election? What should they do? What should be their 2027 first 100 days plan? How do we make sure that we don't get back to where we were?
Yeah, so I think the first thing any new government has to do, and look, every country has to decide for themselves, right? I'm not trying to. First of all, because Israelis know far more than I about what's possible. Second of all, because democracy means outsiders don't tell you what to do, right? So with those caveats, let me just say that I think what many Israelis have seen is the fragility of the system, both the lack of entrenchment of the basic laws and the fact that the institutions can be changed by simple majority votes, so that if you happen to be unlucky enough to get one of these unbreakable coalitions. Again, unstable coalitions was the source of Israeli democratic vibrancy all these years. And now we can see that isn't something that can be counted on. So, I think we need to think about, Israel needs a constitution. If not a single text constitution, then at least more entrenchment of the institutions. And it needs to ensure a vibrant press. It needs to ensure a vibrant civil society. And it needs public education about just how fragile democracy is. And you would think, this is the part that's such a heartbreak for me, right? I went into teaching comparative constitutional law out of a sense of never again about the Holocaust, never again to those 20th century dictatorships and what they did to people. We're now far enough away from them that the memory of those things has faded and has gotten kind of stick-figured or something, has gotten caught in a set of easy assumptions, right? And I don't want to wish the world those dictatorships ever again.
No, I totally agree with you. You probably have the same experience. I teach mostly graduate level and not undergrad, and yet the graduate level, my graduate level students don't know a lot about World War II, nor the Holocaust, nor what happened. It's very, very, when I raise these issues, when I talk about the history of media and media regulation, those are quaint and far ideas for most of our students today.
So I teach a course on rule of law at graduate level, big course. The opening reading every year is Robert Jackson's opening statement at the Nuremberg trials. Both because it's a good introduction to rule of law and all these questions, but also because he reviews the evidence for the Holocaust. It's not just a number. It's the mechanisms. It's what happened. It was, as just one piece of reading, it's just powerful oratory and it's powerful factual proof. And it's also proof that rule of law matters, right? So
Yeah.
that's my go-to. I mean, I teach it so often I could almost recite it, even though it's very long. And, we have to keep renewing those memories, not just in the abstract and not just with like a national holiday or whatever, but with the detail of how it happened, And
Yeah.
so that's why, for me, like watching Israel, of all places, Israel going through this, is just like, I keep saying, like, if you guys don't know, right, that legacy and how fragile democratic government is, like, how can we teach it anywhere else? So, I mean,
Yeah, and Israel is particularly bad because after the hostage deal, most Israelis, like 60 or 70%, are huge supporters of Trump. And they
yeah,
are totally
yeah,
unaware of what Trump is doing in the
yeah,
U.S.
yeah. I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, so every time it will come in new clothing. Right? But if you don't understand the underlying mechanisms, right? The concentration of power, the demonization of others, the weaponization of all branches of the state against political enemies, the creation of scapegoats, the creation of camps, for God's sake. I mean, I mean, the U.S. is busily building these several thousand person
Yeah.
detention camps all over the country. And how can some of the Jewish community in the U.S. support Trump? I mean, doesn't this look familiar? I mean, anyway. I will not go on and on. But I mean,
Yeah.
the reason for
All right.
just saying that it's such a particular heartbreak for me to watch this in Israel, because I always thought that Israeli democracy has always been fragile. I mean, it's a simple kind of government, not entrenched constitution. Governments rise and fall, near misses of all kinds. But
Occupation
ultimately,
of the Palestinians.
and of course, I mean, and the unsettled question of the territories or of the status of Palestinians within Israel. I mean, all of that, of course. That said, it felt like there was always a conversation going on. However, it failed to resolve, but conversation is the essence.
Not anymore, because as you know, the youth in Israel, unlike most of the world, is more right-leaning, illiberal. It's
Yeah.
probably the only rich country in the world where actually the younger you go, you have more illiberal ideas, which is very different than the OECD countries, the Europe and the US. Professor Kim Lane Shepeley, thank you very much for joining us.
Yes, thank you so much. Always great to talk to you and keep Haaretz going. You're a voice that Israel needs.
כן, רבותיי, עד כאן השיחה עם פרופסור שפלי. אני רוצה לחזור ותרגם את ממש הדקות האחרונות של השיחה הזאת. אני מתבוננת בישראל בכאב הולך וגובר, היא אומרת לנו. לראות את ישראל מכל המקומות בעולם, דווקא ישראל, זה בלתי נספס, זה שובר לי את הלב. הישראלים עדיין לא מבינים עד כמה שלטון דמוקרטי הוא שברירי, ואני רואה את התבנית הזאת שוב ושוב בעולם. בכל פעם היא מופיעה בלבוש חדש, ריכוז כוח, דמוניזציה של מיעוטים, של אחרים, והפיכת זרועות המדינה לנשק נגד אויבים פוליטיים. דמוקרטיות לא קורסות, הן מתרוקנות מבפנים. ממש לפני סיום השיחה, כפי ששמעתם, שפלי כבר לא הייתה מנתחת מפוקחת, אלא כמעט זועקת. איך חלק כל כך גדול מהקהילה היהודית היא שעלה יכולים לתמוך בטראמפ, לאור הנטיות הסמכותניות שלו? הרי אם זה לא נראה לכם מוכר, דווקא אצלכם היהודים, דווקא אצלכם במדינת היהודים, שנולדה מתוך ההבטחה של לעולם לא עוד, הדפוסים המוכרים של ריכוז כוח חוזרים רק בלבוש אחר. לא בצעדים גדולים וברורים, אלא בהצטברות שקטה של כוח, בהקהיית חושים ובשכחה. הפחד הגדול שלה, וגם שלי אני חייב לציין, איננו מהמנהיגים, אלא מהרגע שבו חלקים שלמים מהחברה מפסיקים לזהות מה קורה לחברה כולה. כשהכל נראה לכאורה אותו דבר, עד שברגע אחד הכל כבר אחר לגמרי. זהו, עד כאן המרקרים להשבוע. נקווה ששבוע הבא נוכל לעסוק בעניינים יותר שמחים ועליזים. נקווה שיתברר לאן הולכת הפסקת האש הזאת. נקווה להיות יותר אופטימיים. נקווה שיתחיל להתעורר דיון יותר מעמיק, יותר מעניין, בסוג של האופוזיציה שצריכה להתארגן ולקום למשטר הנוראי הזה לקראת הבחירות הקרובות. זהו, תודה רבה לצוות שלנו בחג הזה, לדן ברומר, העורך האגדי בעיקר, למפיקים שלנו, יאלי שביט ואסף פרידמן. תודה לכם המאזינים שאתם שומרים לנו אמונים גם בימי חג ובימי מלחמה קשים אלה, בין ריצה לממדים והתעדכנויות בהתראות הבלתי נגמרות. עד כאן ולהתראות בשבוע הבא.
ובתוך הדפים